All right, so like I said, my name is Sara Espinoza, Manager for Professional Development at ISAC, and I'll be talking about the alternative app and the Fafsa mandate as well. Before I get into the alternative app and the Fafsa mandate, I do want to encourage you all to, if you are working for a college or university, I want to encourage you all to add your school to the college advising database for undocumented students, or the IACC undocumented guide. Um, we only have about 72 colleges on there, and I know there are way more than 72 colleges in Illinois alone. So we do ask, and I strongly encourage you, if you work for an institution, and you provide resources for undocumented students, or you have a designated point of contact, to please include your contact info in the database. I've included the link here. So like I said, you'll have a copy of the presentation readily available. And I want to make sure that if you are there, that you can fill out this information. There is a series of questions that will be asked in order to add your institution on there. But essentially what we're trying to do with this, and what we've been trying to do for the last few years, is to get this information in a single location for students, to know, if you have a point of contact at your institution, who that is, if you offer financial aid, what process students have to follow for that, if they have questions about the admissions process, who they need to contact. So we want to create a centralized location for undocumented students to be able to find the information they need without having to go from one person to another at the institution, trying to figure out the answer to their questions, right? And obviously we don't expect there to be just one person dedicated to undocumented issues, right? Like, not ideally, this is a work that involves everybody, not just one person, but we understand that institutions might have a designated point of contact, especially now with the undocumented student liaisons. But there's a session on that later on this afternoon as well. But I will go ahead and get started. Just wanted to make sure I included that and encourage you to add your institution if you're not on there already. So these are some of the things I'll talk about this morning. I'll start off with the Illinois FAFSA mandate, which is what it's commonly known as, but it's Public Act 101-0180. I'll talk about the Retention of Illinois Students and Equity Act, RISE Act, as a segue into some of the information in the rest of the session. So I'll talk about the RISE Act, eligibility criteria from the RISE Act, and then the alternative app, and I'll include information on pre-screening questions and how to get started with the application, as well as an application walkthrough. So again, as you're joining, those of you that have just joined, if you have questions, please include them in the chat. I might not see them as I am presenting, but I will try to leave time at the end for questions. All right, so I'm going to get into it with the Public Act information, or like I said, this is commonly known as a FAFSA mandate by many people, starting with the 2020-2021 school year. In addition to all other graduation requirements, students who are enrolled at Illinois public high schools, when they are high school seniors, they have to meet one of the following in order to satisfy their graduation requirements. So this is a new thing that went into place, like I said, for the 2021 school year. Students do have to meet complete one of the following to meet this requirement. So they either have to complete a FAFSA, or they have to file an application for state financial aid, or they have to file a waiver or opt-out form with their school district. So I will go into more detail about those, but just know that that is the new graduation requirement specifically for students graduating from Illinois public high schools. Now, there's a little bit more information on the requirement itself. I know there's a lot of questions typically that come up with this, and some of you might be wondering why I'm talking about the FAFSA mandate at the alternative app session. But like I said, because this is a graduation requirement, there are a lot of questions that come up, and whether or not, like, if a student is not FAFSA eligible, what they do. So that's part of the reason that this is included in here. But on the school district side, school districts are required to require students to comply with this public act, but also support students throughout the process. Schools will have to provide the student and the parent any assistance or information to comply with this public act. And essentially what this is meant to do is to provide additional information to students about their options for paying for college. It's not meant to create another barrier for students, right? So students can still graduate if for whatever reason they're not able to complete a FAFSA, an alternative app, or get a waiver signed. There are still ways that the high schools can still award that student a diploma. So they can still, like I said, award that diploma due to extenuating circumstances, if the school district determines that the student meets those criteria, and if the student has satisfied all other graduation requirements. In this case, the principal would attest to the school district that they made a good faith effort to help the student through this process and tried to help the student fill out an application or waiver. So like I said, it's not FAFSA only, it's not alternative app only. The other option that students do have is the opt-out or waiver form. So you might hear, officially it's called the opt-out form, but a lot of people refer to it as officially it's called the FAFSA non-participation form, but a lot of people refer to it as the opt-out or waiver form. For this public act, this is a form that was created by ISB. It must be filed with the school district, and it will indicate that either the parent or the guardian of a student, unless a student is 18 or older, they can fill it out on their own. But this indicates that the parent knows what the application is and has chosen, along with their student, to not complete the application. In some situations, it might be a matter of not being able to complete the application, and that's a valid reason too for completing a waiver. But just not to single anyone out, we didn't necessarily, or ISB didn't necessarily put language in there that says I can't fill it out. It's more so I understand what this is and have chosen not to. That way nobody has to worry about disclosing status or anything like that on the form. There is a specific email address that ISB created for questions about this public act and the waiver or opt-out form, and it is provided on here. It's fafsa@isb.net. The waiver is available in both English and Spanish. It is available on the ISB website as well as the ISAC website, so you'd be able to find that on either one of our sites. This is a look at that waiver. So the non-participation form, it's just one page, double-sided. One side will have, this first page will have the information that they need to provide, the student info, the parent info, and the school information. And then this is where they sign acknowledging that they know what the FAFSA is, the alternative app is, and that they're choosing not to complete it. The backside of it actually provides them with some information on the applications, right? It's an FAQ portion that talks about the FAFSA and where they can get assistance to complete an application, a financial aid application. So they are required to read this information and then also sign on the other side. All right, now I will get into the information or background from the RISE Act as I transition into the alternative app. So now that I've gotten through the Public Act for FAFSA, for the FAFSA mandate, essentially, we'll move into the RISE Act. So the RISE Act is a legislation that was signed into law on June 21st, 2019. It became effective January 1, 2020. So 2 months before the start of the pandemic, this went into effect. And essentially what the RISE Act did is that it lifted the 75 MAP paid credit hour cap for students who had not reached junior level status. So essentially the MAP grant, which is a grant that's awarded to students here in Illinois based on need, on financial need, typically or formerly had a cap where students who hadn't reached junior level status were not able to use any more MAP credit hours beyond 75 until they had reached that junior level status. So that was part of the RISE Act, that 75 MAP paid credit hour cap was lifted. But the biggest piece for which I think a lot of people know the RISE Act or are familiar with the RISE Act is that it created a pathway for eligible undocumented students and transgender students who are generally disqualified from federal student aid to apply for not only ISAC, but other state financial aid programs. So anything that's state funded, any state funded programs, the RISE Act would allow those students to apply for those programs. Now, again, remember, this is just for state purposes, so it still wouldn't apply to federal programs, but this is specifically for Illinois state funded programs. And I forgot to mention, if at some point you see my computer move or you see a visitor on my screen, my dog is here with me, so he might make an appearance throughout the session. So I apologize for that in advance. So a little bit more on the RISE Act. Like I said, it is for all state funded programs, but because of the RISE Act, it sort of came hand in hand with ISAC providing or creating an alternative process for awarding MAP grants. So typically students who are FAFSA eligible are automatically considered for MAP, right? There was no separate application for MAP, and there still isn't for students who are FAFSA eligible. So if you're FAFSA eligible, you fill out your FAFSA and you're considered for MAP. But if you're not FAFSA eligible and you fit the criteria of either qualifying undocumented student or transgender student, you needed an alternative process to apply for MAP, right? Because you weren't filling out a FAFSA. So that's where the alternative app came from. So ISAC created a form, a different application known as the alternative app, where students could apply for essentially for MAP, but institutions we've seen a lot of institutions also use it for their own institutional aid. The RISE Act does rely on existing criteria to determine who's considered a resident of the state of Illinois. So they took the language for the in-state tuition law, and if any of you were at the Immigration 101 session, Ida could have talked a little bit about in-state or some of those legislations. So the language from that legislation was taken, specifically the definition for who's considered a resident, in order to apply that as well for the RISE Act. This does impact aid at all Illinois colleges, whether public, private, two-year, four-year institutions, anything that is state funded is open for undocumented students to apply. And so that, like I said, not just ISAC programs, but any programs available at colleges, universities that are state funded, as well as anything from other agencies, such as DCFS, which I know I've typically gotten a lot of questions about those. So programs from DCFS are also now open at the state level for undocumented students who meet this criteria. Now, these are the criteria that were written into the RISE Act. And like I said, this definition specifically came from the Public Act 970003, which is the one for in-state tuition purposes. And this is basically just a definition of who's considered an Illinois resident, because you have to keep in mind all state financial aid programs are awarded to state residents of Illinois. This has nothing to do with immigration status. Meeting the criteria for Illinois residency is a whole set of rules that students have to meet. So in order to be considered a resident, I will go through these criteria, but keep in mind that students have to meet all 5 of these criteria, and not just 1 or 2. It has to be that they meet all 5 of these. So the first one is that students must reside with a parent or guardian while attending an Illinois public or private high school. Students must graduate from a public or private high school in Illinois or receive their diploma equivalency from Illinois. They must attend an Illinois school for at least 3 years as of the day they graduated from high school or receive the equivalent of a high school diploma. Now, I know that wording is always a little weird, the way it's worded in the legislation. Essentially, that specific point just means students have to have attended school in Illinois for at least 3 years prior to graduating or prior to getting their GED or diploma equivalency. Those 3 years don't have to be consecutive. It just has to be 3 years prior to graduating or getting their high school diploma. The student will have to provide the institution with an affidavit stating that they will file an application to become a permanent resident of the US at the earliest opportunity they are eligible to do so. This does not mean that your student has to go out and hire an immigration attorney or anything like that. For the RISE Act, this is just a simple certification and acknowledgement that's built into the alternative app already. So students would just read that section, and then by signing the application digitally, they would be confirming that, yes, if there's ever the opportunity for me to apply for residency, either through immigration reform or anything else, I will take advantage of that opportunity. And then lastly, students must not have established a residence outside of Illinois. Now with MAP specifically, MAP has its own eligibility criteria, which are outlined here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you on these specific set of rules, just because there's still a lot to cover that I want to get through, especially with the application itself. But just know that MAP has its own set of eligibility criteria, right? Students do have to complete either a FAFSA if they're FAFSA eligible, or an alternative app if they are not FAFSA eligible. They do still have to be considered Illinois residents. They have to demonstrate financial need because this is a need-based grant. Students do have to be enrolled for a minimum of 3 credit hours in some sort of program that leads to a degree or certificate. And then they have to meet satisfactory academic progress as defined by their institution. Students have to enroll in an Illinois MAP approved school, which is a super important piece because this can't be taken outside of the state of Illinois. So because it is a state funded program, students who are eligible for MAP can use their MAP grant at Illinois MAP approved institutions, which would pretty much be all of our public institutions, the majority of our nonprofit private institutions, but then only a handful of the for-profit institutions. So there is a list on the ISAC website, or if you just Google ISAC MAP approved schools, you'll get a list of the schools that by academic year are MAP eligible. And it's super important that your students are attending a MAP eligible school if they are getting MAP, because if they go to a non-eligible school or if they go out of state, they can't use their MAP grant there. And I'm trying to see some of the questions as I go through. Yes, I will be providing a copy of the presentation, not just for this one, but just know for all of the conference sessions, we will be providing recording or posting recordings and any set presentations we get from presenters on the conference website. I also see another question here about trainings. We do offer trainings. If you go on our website at isac.org/PD, you can request a training for your staff on completing the alternative app, or basically anything related to financial aid. All right. Give me one sec. Okay. All right, so along with the criteria that I went through, MAP also has the residency criteria for dependent students. They are required to report parental information. So that again comes from either the FAFSA, the alternative app will tell them if they're considered dependent students, but they will need to provide that information if they are determined to be a dependent student. In that case, for dependent students, they are considered residents of the state of Illinois the minute the parents make Illinois their fixed and permanent home. So let's say I'm going back to my high school years. I grew up in Texas. So let's say I'm still in Texas. My mom moves to Illinois first to, secure a home for us. And then I make the move later on. It doesn't matter that I'm still in Texas. The moment my mom makes Illinois our permanent fixed, or her permanent fixed home, then I also become a resident of the state of Illinois as a dependent, right? So students, as soon as your parent moves, you are a resident of Illinois. But for independent students who don't have to provide parental information, it is a little different in that you have to not only reside in Illinois at the time of the application, but you also must have resided in Illinois for at least 12 continuous months prior to the start of the year for which you're requesting financial aid. So let's say if you're starting this August and you're an independent student, then you must have resided in Illinois for the last 12 months, so since last August, in order to receive financial aid. So those are 12 continuous months for independent students. Now with the alternative application process, like I said, I'll get into more of this in the next section, but just know this is an overview of the process. Students will go through some pre-screening questions, then they'll be prompted to create a student profile where they will be assigned an ISAC ID number. This will be sort of the number that is assigned to them so that we can find their application if there's any issues, or if the schools need to look up their student. It's essentially the replacement for a social security number, which is what students would provide on their FAFSA. And the ISAC ID number is their unique identifier for their application. And students will keep that same ISAC ID number as they renew for follow-up years. Students who are completing the alternative app will be providing the exact same information that's requested from students for the FAFSA. So we created the application the exact same way. And I say we as ISAC, I had no hand in creating the alternative app, but the alternative app was designed with the same questions built into it as the FAFSA does. So we wanted to have a way that we could use that same information and use the same formula that's built into the FAFSA to determine students' financial need for eligibility for the MAP grant. Students and parents will be able to sign electronically. So I know the FAFSA doesn't offer that for parents who don't have socials, but for this specifically, students and parents will sign electronically using a PIN that will be provided by ISAC. So they don't have to create a PIN. They will automatically get assigned a PIN by ISAC. The application will calculate an expected family contribution, which is a little number that basically comes from the FAFSA, also comes from the alternative app, that's used to determine how much a student and their family can afford to contribute for 1 year of college. Then that number is used to calculate and determine MAP eligibility. All right, I'm going to make a quick pause here because I know there's a couple of questions in the chat. I think there's one about eligibility. So it says, would students that are older than 18 that obtain a GED at our community college and don't live with parents as older than 18 be eligible for in-state tuition rate? 30, for example, 30-year-old student lives on their own, undocumented, lives here longer than 3 years. So I think that's a little bit, I might need more info on that, but essentially if a student, there's two different things here. In-state tuition rate versus eligibility for MAP. In-state tuition rate can technically be a little bit more flexible by the institution. So some schools might say, you just have to show us that you live in the district for community colleges, or you might just show us that you, for public institutions, a lot of them might still ask for the affidavit. There is that same affidavit that's used for the alternative app is also asked for in-state tuition purposes at public universities. So as far as in-state tuition rate, they might still be eligible even if they're no longer living with the parent, things like that. But for alternative app and the MAP grant specifically, they do have to not only reside with the parent or guardian while they're attending high school, but they must have attended school in Illinois for at least 3 years before getting that diploma. So that's the important piece with that. Before they actually graduate or get that diploma, they would have to have attended school here for at least 3 years. I'm going to put the link for the other question said, do you offer trainings for institutions on alternative app? I'll include that. I've included the link to our website there where you can request a presentation. All of our services are free. Somebody asked, what is the average amount of funds a student would get? So I'm assuming that's for MAP specifically, but that depends on the year and the formula. Right now for the current year, the current MAP award, the current MAP award is $5,661. So it also depends, like I said, on the credit hours the student is enrolled in, whether they're enrolled full-time, part-time. So there are a number of different factors that play a role in the amount that students can get from MAP. All right, so for the alternative application, you'll see on here outline the information that the students will need to provide in order to complete the application. So students will have to create, like I said, a student profile. That's not something necessarily that they need to provide, but it is something that they do need to create in order to access the application. They'll need to provide a student and parent email address. And this is really important because they need to have unique email addresses. They can't just use the same one for both the student and the parent. They need to have unique email addresses because each one will have, well, they will get an email with their own PIN. So they can't use the same email for both people. They'll have to provide records of income just like they would with the FAFSA. Tax returns, W-2s, any other records of income earned from work, from businesses, child support paid or received, and then any other untaxed income. So this is exactly the same information, like I said, that we ask for students, that we ask from students completing the FAFSA, same thing for the alternative app. One key question that we get with undocumented populations is, what if my parents aren't filing taxes, right? And so one thing to keep in mind is that all of this is based off of IRS guidelines. And so simply being undocumented doesn't mean that you can't file taxes. And so if based on the income of that student or the parents, it is deemed that they are required to file taxes and they should be filing taxes. And I know that's a super tough conversation sometimes to have with parents because a lot of parents are hesitant to disclose status or to, fill out any federal forms or anything like that. But just keep in mind that that is part of the process. It is required. And if students don't provide this information, whether it's for FAFSA or alternative app, they do end up getting stuck in the verification process and unable to continue. And so they won't be able to get any funds until that process is completed. So encourage parents to get an early start on their taxes every year. If they haven't filed, if you're currently working with anybody who still hasn't filed taxes, they can still do so. There might be other things that they'll need to work through. They might need to work with a tax attorney to be able to address any issues regarding their tax returns, but they can still file taxes using an Itin. So that's the individual taxpayer identification number in place of a social security number. And again, that doesn't disclose any type of status or lack of status for anyone because Itins are issued to anyone who doesn't have a social. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be undocumented. It might mean you're here on a visa or you're here on a temporary work permit. You might still not be eligible for for a social, right? So depending on the situation, it doesn't necessarily out your status. It just means you're filing taxes with an ITIN number or with an ITIN. And then students will also have to provide information about investments, including anything like savings, CDs, stock options, bonds, 529 plans, real estate, businesses, farms, etc. And then, like I said, they'll use a PIN to sign electronically, which they will get directly from ISAC. These are the different sections of the alternative app that I'll be getting into. So you'll start off with student demographic info and the student financials. Then you'll have the dependency status questions to determine whether or not a student needs to provide their parent info. If they do, they'll go into section 4. If they don't, then they'll skip over to section 5. And then school selection is section 6. This is where they select which schools they want their information sent off to via the alternative app. And then the last portion is the sign and submit section. Just some additional info on the alternative app. Students do have the option to save and return to the application at a later time. So if they can't complete it in one sitting, that's totally fine. They can come to it later. They do, however, have to provide all of their financial information manually. So if you've worked with students on completing a FAFSA, you know that there's an IRS data retrieval tool on the FAFSA. That is because that is a federal partnership between the IRS and the Department of Education. That's not available at the state level. So for alternative app, everybody has to input their information manually. Some questions may be pre-populated based on previous answers, whether it's from their student profile or from previous years that they've completed the alternative app. If students and parents do have questions, there's a help feature on there where they can click on the question mark next to each question and see additional information about that question, and then also find the corresponding question on the FAFSA in case they want to compare, they want to be able to see some of the additional information from the FAFSA itself, some of those notes that they have on there. Applicants can also troubleshoot their username and password using the challenge questions they created when they started their student profile. So if they get locked out or something like that, they can retrieve that username or password. I will say, make sure that if your students start an application and let's say they lose their password, their username, don't have them create another question, because all that's doing is creating 2 applications for them, which can end up being a little problematic. Make sure that they reset their password and that they access the application that they've already started. And same thing if they need to make corrections, they are able to go back in and make corrections, but make sure they're not just starting over, that they're actually correcting the application that they already worked on. So in order to get started with the application, there are a couple of different spots on the ISAC website where students can access the application. They can go directly to isac.org/alternative-application, or directly from the ISAC homepage, they can click on where on the bottom, on the first screenshot that you see on here, on the lower left-hand side of my screen. Let me see if I can point here for y'all. You will be able to navigate. Let's see if you can see this. Nope, you can't see that. You will be able to navigate under the featured column. There is a section called RISAC, an alternative application for Illinois financial aid. That is the full name of the application, but I know most people call it the alternative app. So you'll be able to go on there, click, and it'll take you to that same website. And you'll see that second page on here is where students will initially go to, because they'll have that information they'll have all the information about the alternative app on there. So we want to make sure that students have access to understand what the alternative app is, eligibility criteria, anything that they need access to in order to complete the FAFSA or to complete the alternative app, but also to understand if they're eligible for it, right? So that they don't spend time on an application and then later find out that either they're not eligible or that they're actually eligible for the FAFSA. So this will help them understand that information a little bit better before they get into any of the specifics with the application. Now, on the screenshot that's on the right-hand side, you'll see on here that square that says alternative application for Illinois financial aid. That's where you actually click on to get into the application. So it was purposely designed this way so that students do have to go to this page with all of the information on the eligibility criteria and the application process. One other thing is it's very small in here, but there's a little button on the second screenshot here on the screen that says en español. So if you click on that, this entire page will be translated over to Spanish, including the video. There's a video on here in English. It's a 1-minute video that talks about what the RISE Act and the alternative app are. That video will also show up in Spanish if you click that en español button. All right, so we'll get a little bit more into it. And this is what the homepage for the alternative app looks like. Students will have access to selecting the correct academic year that they're applying for. There's a section for first-time applicants versus returning applicants or parents who are just there to submit their signature. There's also a section on here right above the academic year that says see our user guide and resources. So there are some user guides that will help students understand the different parts of the application, what information they need to provide, some additional information regarding privacy, and some of the FAQs that we've put together on there. Once a student continues or gets started with the application, before they get into the application, like I said, first they'll see some pre-screening questions. But before the pre-screening questions, there is a disclaimer from ISAC regarding information on the MAP, about the alternative app or FAFSA, confidentiality, privacy, all of that information that we want to make sure students have on the front end. Then students will get into the pre-screening questions. One thing to point out before I get into the pre-screening questions is that the answers to the pre-screening questions are not shared with the colleges or universities that the student lists on their application. This is simply to assess whether or not a student is eligible to continue with the alternative app. So there is information that they'll have to provide on here that students might be a little bit hesitant about. You can let them know that this information is just between the student and ISAC. It's just between the student and the application. It's not shared with colleges or universities. So essentially, when the student gets into the application, there's 2 pathways that they can take. One would be as an undocumented student. One would be as a transgender student. The first pre-screening question will determine their citizenship status to try to figure out if the student is FAFSA eligible or if they can proceed. If the only students that might be FAFSA eligible that are completing the alternative app would be those students who are transgender, who are not able to complete the FAFSA because of the selective service requirement, which recently has changed, but the alternative app is still includes them as of now. So I want to make sure that I address that. And they'll be presented on this first screen with the definition for citizen and eligible non-citizen as used by the Department of Education for financial aid eligibility purposes. The students will be asked if they're a citizen or if they meet those criteria, and they'll select at the bottom. There's one question that says, are you a US citizen or someone who meets a description of eligible non-citizen in one of the bullets listed above? So in that case, if you're working with undocumented students, they are not considered citizens of the US and they're not considered eligible non-citizens. So they would select no. In this second question, this is where you start to get into that pathway of, whether you're an undocumented student or a transgender student. Undocumented students will then see a question that asks them about the RISE Act criteria. So if the student says no to the citizenship question, they'll be presented with the RISE Act eligibility criteria, which has all of those 5 requirements that I mentioned earlier, and they have to meet all of them. The question at the bottom says, do you meet all of the above criteria? So it is important that students read through these carefully and that they answer yes only if they meet all 5 of those. For students who are transgender, after they answer yes to the citizenship question, they'll be provided with some additional questions regarding federal student aid eligibility. They'll also be prompted to provide their social security number. This is only for students who are citizens. So if you're working with undocumented students who have DACA and have a social, they will not be asked to provide their social on the alternative app. This is only for students who mark yes that they're citizens, so that we can track any MAP paid credit hours. Because I mentioned for students who are FAFSA eligible, who do have a social, typically we use their social as their unique identifier, versus alternative app, they'll get an ISAC ID number. So in order to sort of reconciliate that for students who maybe have already gotten MAP in the past and have a social, we do ask them for their social security number. This section for transgender students will also ask them, are you a transgender person? And if they hover over transgender, they'll see what's defined as transgender on the application, and then they can answer yes or no. Again, this information is not shared with their colleges or universities, so they don't have to worry about outing themselves in any type of way at the institution. It's simply to determine their ability to continue. And then students will be presented with the Illinois residency requirement as well, the information, and then it'll tell them if they're eligible or not to complete the application. So based on their responses, it'll tell them, yes, you can complete it. No, you can complete it. All students, regardless of the pathway they took, though, will be presented with a question that says, have you already filed a FAFSA for this academic year? That's not to encourage students or discourage them from filling out a FAFSA. It's just because we don't want students completing both. Ideally, they should be completing one or the other. All right, so as we get into the application, like I said, once students go through that pre-screening question or those pre-screening questions, if they answered all of them and the system determines, yes, based on your answers, you can proceed into the application, then they will be able to create a student profile. And this is going to essentially just be their login information to be able to access the alternative app. This doesn't mean that they have to do anything extra or create anything directly with the Department of Education. This is just their student profile specifically for the alternative app. And on this student profile page, students will be required to enter all of the information that's asked on here. They can't use the same email that they've used in the past if they've accessed the ISAC student profile or student portal profile. So they have to have a separate email. If they've already accessed the ISAC student portal in the past with an email address, they should use a different one. One other thing to keep in mind for not only for FAFSA, for alternative app students, but for FAFSA eligible students is that we encourage students to use an email that they'll have regular access to. So ideally not their school email address, because a lot of students will lose access to that once they graduate. So we encourage students to use a personal email that's appropriate, that they're using for their college process, to use that for financial aid as well. And then students will be assigned their ISAC ID number after they complete the section and they proceed into the application. But as you can see on the screen, the student profile portion is pretty straightforward. It's mostly just the student's name, email, and then their challenge question and challenge answer, and then their password. So it's a very basic profile that they're creating right here. They're not providing any type of sensitive information. Then they'll proceed into the introduction page. This will tell them a little bit more about the alternative app, how to get help, what can they save the application and come back to it later, how would they sign it, what they do if they need to make a correction. So essentially a lot of information on the front end about questions that we typically get from students, and then anything about how they can get assistance with this or what information they need to provide in the application. With the student demographic portion, this will be step one of the application, and you actually can see at the top, it's kind of small, but like I said, you'll have access to the copy of this presentation. At the top on here, it does tell you the different sections, and the one that's highlighted is the one that the student is currently working on. So that first section is the student demographic information, and right below it, that square in red or that rectangle, that's actually their ISAC ID number. So they will be able to see that number on every screen throughout the application. I encourage students to write it down. They'll see it on there, but I do encourage them to write it down just for their record so that they have access to it in a spot that's easily accessible to them, so that they don't have to log on to email or log into the application to access that in case they need it. So ideally they should write that down. This is where they'll start providing some of their information in more detail. Their name might already be populated because of the information they've provided in the student profile, but they'll provide also mailing address, the state that they reside in. Ideally it would be Illinois, again, for eligibility purposes, since residency is required. And then they'll provide date of birth and other information specific to the student. In the next section, they'll start providing, or they'll add additional demographic information about marital status. If they are married, they will need to report their spouse's information as well. And then there is an optional question in here that asks about gender. This question is for research purposes only, and so the student, this is one of the few questions that is optional. They don't have to answer it if they prefer not to, but it does ask them about their gender, and this is only between the student and ISAC. That's also not necessarily something that will be shared with third parties. And then further into the students' demographic section, you'll see we start asking questions about the student's level in high school, their parents' highest level of schooling completed. And so with that question, we also get a lot of questions. It is the highest level attained. So it'll say highest level completed by parent one and then by parent two. If your parent went to college but didn't finish, then the highest level attained would be high school. Or if your parent, based on whatever they attended, it's just whatever is the highest level that they actually fully completed. Then we'll move into student financial section. This is where students will provide information on their financial info, taxes. So for this upcoming fall, October 1, that will be for students who are applying for the following academic year, and they will be using 2021. But as of right now, they're still using 2020 IRS income tax return status information. So students will be, this is for students specifically. So the student work, and this is one section where not only with the alternative app, but with the FAFSA, we see a lot of mistakes where students start seeing tax information questions and they automatically assume that it's asking about their parents. So no, this section specifically at the top, it will tell you student information. So this is only applicable if your student worked. So if your student worked, then they have to report their own financial info. They also, if the student is married, they'll also be required to report their spouse's financial info. But again, this is a student section, and parent info and parent tax info should not be entered here until we get to the parent section. And then they'll also have to report information about investments, savings, real estate, farms, anything else that they have that they would add, that they would include in there as an asset on the application. And then you'll have some additional questions just about additional information that a lot of this is in there because it's from the FAFSA, but I haven't seen a lot of students who are undocumented or whose parents are undocumented that fall into this category and that have something to report on here. Parents would know if they have something to report on here because it is something that they report within their tax returns or with their accountants. But otherwise, if they don't have anything to report here, that's totally fine. I know sometimes people freak out or get a little confused because like, is it bad that I have nothing here? No, it just means if you have any additional financial information that is applicable under one of these categories, then this is a section to report it. But if you don't have anything else to report, then that's fine. You don't have to. And then on here, you have additional untaxed income information. So this is information that's not reported anywhere else on the form, but that needs to be reported, such as any child support received, any IRA deductions, distribute or untaxed portions of IRA distributions, other housing or living allowances for members of the military, clergy, or others. So essentially, again, anything else that is considered untaxed income would be reported here. And in the student section specifically, there is a question that says any money received or paid on your student's behalf. This is only in the student section, and this only applies if the student gets any funds from, let's say, another relative or friend or whoever to pay for college or to pay for some of their bills or expenses, then that information needs to be reported. The only thing that wouldn't be reported is in-kind support. So if, let's say, somebody's letting you stay with them, you wouldn't divide up their rent and report that as money received. Only if you're actually getting those either bills paid on your behalf or you're getting money to cover those bills. The next section will be the one that determines whether or not you have to provide parent info. So if students answer no to all of these questions, they will be required to provide parental information. For the most part, students are dependent until the age of 24. However, a student can answer yes to one of these questions, regardless of their age. They will be able to continue without parental information. If the student is married, however, they will also need to provide their spouse's info in the follow-up section as well. And I will answer that question shortly for the person that asked the question in the chat. For dependencies, students, like I said, for the most part, they're dependent until the age of 24. However, if they are married, they can be considered independent regardless of their age. If a student is pursuing a master's or doctorate program, they're considered independent regardless of their age. Also, if they're active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces or veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces, they would be considered independent. And then if they have children or other dependents, they may be independent, but that's not always the case. And I know this is a very tricky question for students. the way the question is worded, it says, do you have or will you have children who will receive more than half of their support from you throughout the next academic year? And so it's really a three-part question, right? Do you have or will you have children, right? It's asking, do you have kids who will receive more than half of their support from you? And then through the next academic year. So you have to consider all three of those components, and only if a student can say yes to those components, then can they mark yes to this question. There might be students that, yes, they do have children, but they're not the ones providing the majority of the financial support for the kids. It might be the grandparents, right? Or it might be the student's partner or somebody else that's providing for those children. In that case, even though the student has kids or other dependents, if they're not the ones providing more than half of the support for, they would still have to answer no to this question. And then the next set of questions on the follow-up questions on this dependency section will ask students about whether or not they have essentially a parent in their lives, right? So this one will ask if the student has been in foster care since the age of 13, if they're emancipated minors, if they're in legal guardianship through a court, or if they're considered unaccompanied homeless youth by one of the designated people listed below. Now, with guardians, I will caution a couple of things. So first of all, if a student does have a legal guardian, as determined through a court, that student is considered independent. Legal guardian information should not be entered on the alternative app, should not be entered on the FAFSA. Legal guardians are not considered parents. Now, the other part to that is legal guardianship has to be, for financial aid purposes, issued through a court. A notarized document from a parent does not suffice as documentation. It has to be an actual order from a court that shows that the student is either in legal guardianship or emancipated. So keep that in mind, because we do have that question come up quite a bit, especially with parents who maybe issued just like a temporary note for somebody else to take care of their kids in the event that the student is living somewhere else or that the parents get deported. Notarized letters do not suffice for independent status. Now, based on the responses to the questions, the students will either see a screen that says, based on your answers, you're dependent and you have to provide parent info, or you're independent and you don't have to provide parent info. If they are dependent though, and they cannot provide parent info, they do have a section that says, I'm unable to provide information about my parents. They can select that and continue, but they will be required to follow up with their financial aid office to figure out if they qualify for dependency override. However, it is very important to keep in mind that there are unacceptable reasons for continuing without parent information. So some of those unacceptable reasons would be if the parents are unwilling to provide information, if they refuse to pay for college, or the more common one is if the parents don't claim the students on their taxes. It doesn't matter who's claiming the student. I'll get into more of the parent info, but it doesn't matter who's claiming the student on their taxes. If they're not a parent, they should not be reporting their information on the student's alternative app or on the student's FAFSA. And if the student does not live with the parents, that does not matter. It has to be a very specific reason, like maybe the student is fleeing abuse and that's why they don't live with their parents. That could be considered acceptable. But if the student just decided, I'm going to get an apartment and have a roommate or move in with my significant other, then in that case, the student is still considered dependent, even if they're no longer living at home. Now, for purposes of the alternative app and the FAFSA and just financial aid in general, there's three types of parents. There's biological parents, there's adoptive parents, and then there's step parents. But it only applies while that step parent is married to a biological parent, which I know sounds very confusing. But in my situation, my mom remarried, so I have a stepdad. But if my mom divorces my stepdad, then he's no longer considered a step parent, and he would not be able to provide my information, even if for whatever reason I ended up living with my stepdad. He would still not be considered a parent for purposes of the alternative app. So again, biological, adoptive, step parent, that's it. No legal guardians, no aunts, uncle, grandma, sister, neighbor, cousin, unless they've legally adopted the student. No one else should be reporting their information as a parent. Now, if you are working with students who have divorced parents, you would report the information of the parent with whom the student has lived with the longest in the last 12 months. And then if the students spent equal time with each parent, then you move into whichever parent provided the most financial support. There are some changes coming to all of this because, again, we patterned the alternative app based on the FAFSA. There's a lot of changes coming to FAFSA within the next 2 years. So I do strongly encourage you to keep attending sessions where you can stay up to date on financial aid policies and financial aid updates and FAFSA updates, because a lot of that will translate over into the alternative app as well. But this is one of those. This divorced parent criteria will be changing, not for this academic year or not for this upcoming FAFSA, but for the FAFSA that will open October 1 of 2023. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of changes coming to FAFSA and alternative app because of FAFSA simplification. So just be on the lookout for that information, and we will offer webinars on that, but I just wanted to point that out there since you're here today. For students that do have to provide parent info, they'll move into the parent demographic section. In here, they report parent marital status, the date of their most recent change in marital status. If parents have socials, we do ask them to provide a social. If they don't, they can enter all zeros, which is totally fine. Again, that doesn't disclose their status in any type of way. It just means I don't have a social, and there's a variety of different reasons for which people might not have a social. Doesn't mean you're undocumented. For parents, we'll ask for their last name and then the initial of their first name and their date of birth. There's no information on the alternative app or on the FAFSA that asks about a parent's immigration status. So it is asked of from the student, right? Are you a citizen or eligible non-citizen to determine eligibility for aid, but never from the parent. So you can reassure parents that that's never asked, like their status is never asked about on the applications. Parents do have to provide an email address, again, because they have to have somewhere that ISAC can email them a PIN so that they can sign electronically. And then they'll provide information on, or they will list their state of legal residence, which I know has in the past caused a lot of confusion for parents because of the word legal in there. There's no association to immigration status. It's just, what state do you reside in? Like, what state are you a resident of? Then we'll get into parents' household size. This is where parents will report information about any of their children or dependents they have, the number of students or people, or the number of people that will be students that will be enrolled in college during that academic year. And then if the family or if anyone in that household receives benefits from any one of these programs listed below, Medicaid, SSI, SNAP, free or reduced lunch, TANF, or WIC, they would report that on this section. Now, this isn't, I know this part, both on the FAFSA and alternative app, also confuses parents or makes them a little weary of providing that information. This just means if you've already received benefits from this program, it's just a way that the system can identify that the student is already low income, right? This isn't to say, oh, you already got TANF and SNAP. Yeah, we're not giving you financial aid. That's not what that means. And I know that a lot of times families seem to be concerned about that. But this just is another way that the system, the application itself can flag, okay, the student already receives benefits from this. It means that somebody's already deemed that they're a low income student. And so it'll just help with the formula and with the calculation of their EFC on the back end. Section 4 and 5 will be the same, whether or not the student is dependent or independent. So this is where if a student is dependent, they'll provide parent financial info. But if they're independent, they'll provide their financial info along with their spouse's financial info, household size, etc. So the section is essentially the same. It just depends on whether or not you're required to provide parental information. And then section 6, this is where students can list up to 10 schools where they want their information sent off to so that they can get a financial aid offer from those schools, that it will include MAP. Because it is for MAP specifically, it will only include Illinois MAP approved schools in the list, which means no out-of-state schools on here, no non-MAP approved schools. And then students will select their housing option just like they would on the FAFSA, whether they're deciding to live on campus with the parent, off campus, or if it just doesn't apply. And then section 7, this is where students actually have the opportunity to review all of the information. It's a little different than on the FAFSA because the FAFSA actually lets you have a student aid report that's generated within 72 hours after you complete the application. With the alternative app, we sort of do something similar, but it's on the front end before the application is submitted. So when students are in this review section, they'll see a print button at the top right-hand side of the screen. They can click that print button and they'll have a summary of their application. They can save this, they can print it. So if they print, sometimes the computer might say print to PDF, they would be able to save it there, or they can just click save if that gives them that option. But if ideally students would want to save a copy just for their reference, just in case they later see, oh, I made a mistake, or I forgot to add the school and I want to go back in, that they know for sure what they entered on the application if anything comes up later on. And then we're nearing the end of the application. Students will have the opportunity to review their eligibility status, whether they went through the pathway of undocumented student that meets all the criteria for the RISE Act, or if they're deemed US citizens that are transgender students as well. They'll be presented with both eligibility criteria, and then before they proceed to sign. It's just a matter of reviewing that. If they are undocumented students, this is the affidavit piece that they'll have to read through before they sign. It just says, if I'm not a citizen, then I basically understand and I attest that at the earliest opportunity that I can become a citizen or a resident, that I will apply to do so. And then at the bottom, you'll see on here that it says required student signature, and it'll tell you if it's signed or unsigned. At this point, it says unsigned. And then, so they would click to sign the application, or if they need to receive their PIN again, or they didn't get it the first time, they can click resend link and PIN, and they should get that in their email if they haven't already. Then they'll proceed into the parent section. So if they are required to provide parent info, the parents would also have to sign. Parents don't have that certification or affidavit piece because their immigration status does not matter. Their RISE Act eligibility criteria does not matter for the parents. They just have to sign. If the student is required to provide parent info, then that is a requirement that the parents sign. And they'll also have that same screen on here where it says unsigned, resend link, and PIN. Then we'll go back to the student section, and that's where the submit button will appear. And it'll tell them student cannot, like it'll enable that submit button, which means that the student can now submit the application. So it won't allow the student to submit until all necessary signatures have been provided. So that is a big difference with FAFSA, because FAFSA does let you sign or does let you submit without signatures. Alternative app does not. You can save and exit. So you want to make sure that if your students say that they completed it, that they actually have their confirmation page. They'll have a confirmation page at the end. They'll receive a confirmation email as well that says it's been submitted, we've received it, these are the next steps. But if students don't have a confirmation page or confirmation email, it's very likely that they just saved and exited the application and didn't actually submit. And that's basically where the application ends. I do have my contact information here on the screen, and I'm going to get on here through some of the questions. But feel free to ask more questions. If you have a question, you can either add it in the chat or feel free to unmute. We have about, I would say, about 5 more minutes. Since we're going into lunch break, we don't have that same level of urgency to leave the session, but you're welcome to stick around and ask a question. Otherwise, I do appreciate your time and you joining the session today and the conference. We're really excited to have everyone here. But like I said, let me stop sharing on here just so that I can go ahead and see the questions in the chat. All right, so I see on here somebody said, where do I find the opt-out form? So you can find the opt-out form either on the ISB website, which is linked in the presentation, and you'll have a copy of the presentation, or I know you can find it on the ISAC website, which is how I know how to find it a little bit easier. So let me send that in the chat. Somebody said, what if a student's parent isn't present in the student's lives, but they went to college? Should they still include the parent? Also, what if a student's parent went to college outside of the US? Yeah, if the student's parents aren't in the student's lives, but the student knows they went to college, they can still report as the highest level attained was college. If the parents went to college outside of the US, that's still totally fine. This is just a way that, and mostly for institutional purposes, this question is just on there to try to see if the student qualifies for any additional support options or support options as a first gen student. So again, it has no bearing on their financial aid eligibility. It's just more so a statistical analysis of whether a student is first gen and might be eligible for other types of assistance at the college. All right, I don't see any other questions. Thank you all for the feedback. I really appreciate you all sharing those comments. I'm glad that the information was helpful. You are welcome to contact me. I'll throw my contact info in the chat as well. It's on the presentation as well. Oh, wait, I have one more question. Yes, we will be sent. They won't be sent out, but we will send out an email letting you know when the recordings are posted to the website, along with copies of the presentation. So we won't send everything directly via email, but we'll send out an email notification that says all of this is available on the website. All right. Thank you all for joining. Have a good rest of your day and enjoy the rest of the conference.